Hey guys, Junior Jones did it again. So not only did he invite us to the red carpet premiere of the Dial of Destiny in London, but the very next day, while we're out trying to just be tourists, we got a call, and it turns out Empire Magazine invited us to go back and see the movie again, which it turns out was a good thing because our first experience of actually seeing Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny wasn't all that great. The red carpet experience was great, but they put us on the very front row, all the way on the right hand side in an IMAX, so we could see about a quarter of the film at a time. And so we didn't digest it all very well, but we did the second time around. It was much better.
It was a normal screen, and so we were able to actually take in. But the fun thing about this movie was it was a Q&A with the director and the producers. So James Mangold was there explaining how this movie almost became Indiana Jones and the Magical Mystery Tour. Yeah. And they also talked about how they got someone like Antonio Banderas to play such a small role, why they chose Phoebe to do this role, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy this Q&A coming up.
Producer and President of Lucasfilm, Kathleen Kennedy. And producer Frank Marshall. Is that a common experience in your life, seeing people dressed up as Indiana Jones?
Lately, yeah. I've seen a lot of Indiana Jones. It's great. It's fantastic.
So the question and answer thing was really cool. We were all still sitting in the theater with producers and James Mangold down seated. And then a guy from Empire Magazine asked the beginning question. So he asked them about the de-aging tech and how all of that went down. So that was it was neat to hear some of that. The science is changing a lot. It's really different than it was even back when they recently did Princess Leia. Some of us looked at that and said, yikes, that's a little off, isn't it? But this is much better.
And Harrison was actually nervous that we were all going to be really disappointed. So here's what they said.
Kathy, when you started thinking to took over Lucasfilm, was it always in your head to bring back Indy? Was that high on the agenda?
Absolutely high on the agenda, because Indy is something that we continue to talk about nonstop. In fact, because I didn't start out making Star Wars movies, when George asked me to step in and realizing that Indiana Jones was going to be a part of the job, It became a top priority.
And Frank, it was a long journey to get to the screen, and Stephen was umming and ahhing. Is that fair? What was Stephen's relationship?
Well, it's always about getting the right story. The basis for why we do these movies is we try and find the right story that then appeals to all of us, because it's a big job to make these movies. So it just takes time.
And Jim, when it came to you and they said that, give you a chance to take the baton from Steven Spielberg, that's the hardest job in movies, isn't it?
Well, it was Kathy who came and saw me first, and she didn't offer to take the baton from Steven Spielberg, but no one's taking anything from him. But the idea was one that I talked to Kathy about, and then Harrison, and then Steven, and I was, of course, intimidated, a little bewildered, honored, and I really needed to think about it. I mean, the first thing I needed to do was read where they were with the script, because the reality is you can get as tickled as you want about making something, but then you've got to make it, and your screenplay is your roadmap, and without that, you're just driving around with an indie hat on, feeling cool. But you gotta have a script, and that was, and when I saw a script, I felt like they were onto something, but I felt like they were still missing something. And I had an idea about what to do, and it was an opportunity actually to kind of feel out the collaboration with these two and with Harrison and with Steven about just, well, if you don't like what I'm thinking, then, but here's what I'm thinking. And essentially it was just to me that, having known Harrison a while, and he would be the first to say it's pretty obvious that he's a man in his 70s, actually now in his 80s, but that it's kind of unavoidable that Indy is an old man. Right. And that therefore, if you're going to make a movie about this character again, and Harrison is Indiana Jones, then the movie, in a sense, has to address that. We can't kind of make a movie about a guy who's 80 who's pretending he's 40, and that because it would just be dishonest. So in some way, the story of the film to me couldn't just be another adventure and he just happens to be 15 years past having his, his Social Security card. It needs to be, about that. It needs to be, in a way, to me, to turn the bug into a feature. It needs to be, how do we make a movie about a hero in Twilight, not only physically older, because that's the one only obvious part of it, but how the world has changed around him. Because that was something I noticed in Crystal Skull, was with this really interesting change in the films, was that the first three films both take place in the 30s and 40s. And so there's this perfect kind of harmony between Stephen's style and George's style, which is a kind of golden age love of pulpy golden age films, noir films, adventure films, serials. John's scoring, which is a kind of love of similar, Rosa and Korngold and these great classic composers of the golden age. You have Harrison, who's kind of like, looks like he fell out of Treasure of the Sierra Madre with his fedora on and a whip. You have the beautiful kind of high-key lighting and Technicolor, deep focus and strong shadows and all these elements working together within the context of the 30s and 40s where they feel really at home. But what's interesting to me is when you jump forward into the 50s in Crystal Skull, I felt there was a kind of dissonance between the indie style, like right out of the style book, and being in 1950, which is a time, something's happened very big in the 1950s, after World War II, and that's modernism arrived, and suddenly the world is different. It's a rock and roll, and it's a baby boom, and the movies we're watching and the music we're listening to and the whole world is about the future and science fiction, and it's a very different world than Nazis bad, Allies good, in the middle of World War II. There was a very specific alchemy in those things. And so what became a puzzle to me was how to try and find the balance between this old world, which I didn't want to lose, the kind of classic sound and style of indie, but how it could exist in what inevitably would be a movie, given Harrison's age, would be taking place in the 60s. So there was going to be this natural tension that I thought we could try and make something out of instead of trying to fight against. It's similar to The Age. Instead of trying to pretend it wasn't there, in my own mind, the reason that song is playing at the beginning when Indy wakes up in his apartment is because my first idea in my brain of what to call the movie was Indiana Jones and the Magical Mystery Tour. Like I had this, it was my own little flag in my head of what the movie could be, which is this kind of, this wonderful old school hero waking up in this brand new time where he feels a little obsolete. And heroes like him don't really exist anymore, and his focus on the past is not what the culture's about anymore. And obviously what I'm saying might sound like a drag if it was the whole movie, but the point would be, it's a place to start, because one of the critical things as a director and writer you realize is everyone wants to find their hero in the most awesome spot ever. But the problem is you can't make a movie about someone who's just awesome and everything's awesome and they're feeling awesome and everyone's happy. It's a very, once upon a time there was a guy, he was awesome, his family was awesome, they had lots of money and everyone loved him. And so it happened, what happened? It's like, it's a very hard story to tell. So you gotta kind of find your hero in a predicament, and while I didn't want to maintain him in that position through the whole picture, I felt like that was a place to start. And that's what I, long way around, that's what I kind of talked to Kathy and Frank and Harrison and Stephen about, and maybe you could ask them what they thought. But
what do you think?
I'm going to say what we thought was we picked the right guy, and I think that showed. That Jim loved movies, and he really loved indie, and he really understood it, and I think you hear that in the way he talks about it.
Stephen give you some advice?
All the time. I mean, if you're looking after something you found somewhere, but I'll tell you that. But but Stephen was. It wasn't like he dodged in for a bit of advice and then vanished. He was part of us developing the story, reading pages of the script, conferences about the script, and I think I spoke to him at least once a week or every 2 weeks the entire year we were shooting nearly. And he was making Fabelmans in the States, and we were shooting here, and he would bring up or FaceTime or Zoom and kind of tell me how it was going for him, and tell me what he thought of dailies. And I mean, one of Stephen's most clear pieces of advice, I have listened to him talk about his experiences making indie so much, it would be impossible for me to make a kind of chestnut to deliver you. It would be, I could do a 4-hour lecture of all the things I've learned from
Please,
him.
we're here for it.
Yes, but one of the things he said to me early on was just, don't let this movie fool you. You really don't want any scene to be longer than about 30 seconds. And he goes, it's not about how long the movie is, it's about pace. That the movie, he realized in making the first one that he was making a trailer, and that a 2-hour trailer, and that the movie had to operate almost at the pace of a movie trailer. And so scenes had to be, the pace is different than length, and pace is how quickly you get on to the next thing, get new information and get on to the next thing. And that you had to be really conscious of, because that was kind of part of the DNA of these movies, was a kind of insane sense of story tumbling forward.
And Frank, one of the most difficult things about making an indie movie is finding the MacGuffin. Where did the Archimedes style come from?
Well, it was a process. We looked for a long time for a MacGuffin, and based on mythology, something that's real, sort of mythology. And I think that Jim really got to the basis of it because it was about time.
Yeah.
And
I just felt that there was a beauty, if you look at the indie movies, one of the really beautiful things is the way the relic always embodies and kind of braids, really harmonizes with the themes of the story itself. And so, because one of the staples of the movies is kind of this thing, whatever it is going to reveal its potency by the end of the film. And that power ends up making a kind of commentary or a kind of interesting, it has a reflection on the characters. I mean, the easiest one to illustrate it, if I'm not being clear, would be in Raiders, simply that Harrison's playing a very secular, academic, scientific character, a bit bookish, not very social, not great at intimacy, not really, rather be alone with a book, lives in facts and books and digging and artifacts, and that's his passion, and doesn't really believe in anything beyond something he can touch and know. And by the end of the picture, he's standing in a spiritual whirlwind as dark angels fly over and explode Nazis' heads around him. And when he tells Karen Allen, don't open your eyes, it's not just an instruction. If you think about it, it's also that he believes in what's happening around him. He's giving advice to someone he loves because it's the only thing he can grasp in that moment that makes sense, even though the moment to him makes no sense, or his brain is kind of being jarred by what he's confronted with. And that ending in that film is such a powerful thing for that character to confront, because he's such a rationalist, and it doesn't yet make to him any sense, but it's right there in front of him.
When we started talking about using technology like that, it wasn't that from a storytelling standpoint it wasn't an interesting thing to do, because there had been quite a bit of time that had gone on since Crystal Skull, and bridging that with a reminder of just who Indiana Jones was. And the teaser concept is a construct structurally that we've always used in the storytelling of Indiana Jones. But to use technology like that, we weren't sure we could do it perfectly. We needed to do it perfectly, and the only way that we really ended up believing that we could make that work is because Harrison is the one that drives that technology. And once we realized that's how we would get it done, then we all became believers that it was the right thing, including Harrison, because Harrison was the one that was really holding back a bit.
I loved the idea of one of the concepts that was there actually when I came on in the scripts that preceded was a less ambitious but still very a sequence in the war with a young Indy, and I was immediately gripped by it. And I remember Harrison was quite nervous about it, even in the versions of the scripts before I came on. And I remember a really interesting exchange with him where he said to me, you know, the reason I don't like this idea is you get everyone psyched up seeing me at 35, and then they're going to see me now, and then they're going to be disappointed. And I really took that to heart. He's a wonderful and very honest man. And I went home and I thought about it, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I thought, he's exactly right, but that's why we need to do it. And I called him up the next day and I said, you're right, they're going to be disappointed, but that's a good thing, because then you're going to earn it. You're going to show them you're still indie, and you may be a geezer, but you're still indie. and that idea really moved me, that we would draw you in with the youth of this character and the capability, but we would ultimately land you with someone, as in all our lives, where our youth and their glory days are behind us, but that doesn't mean our lives are over, and it doesn't mean what's come before is meaningless and what's coming ahead doesn't matter. And I think that for me was ultimately, the movie wasn't, so when I say, and Frank says the movie's about time, it's not just about time or portals in time, but it's about how time changes the world around us, how time changes us, how time makes us look back at the mistakes we've made and the things we've achieved. And I find that just thinking about it, it was really juicy for me and Jez and John Henry to write about.
Harrison was one of the first actors I ever remember calling out the names of his stunt double. So it was Vic Armstrong and Terry Leonard and Martin Grace. But he still likes to do physical acting these days, doesn't he? Still, for as much as he wants, as much as he can do, Kathy.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of time that we were nervous that he was insisting on doing everything. But he's in phenomenal shape. He's a realist in terms of what it is he thinks he can and cannot do. And I think with this movie, what he really deeply understood sort of speaks to what Jim was talking about, which is when he climbs on that horse, he doesn't want a stunt double climbing on that horse. He wants an old guy climbing on that horse. He understands what that feels like, to know that you could jump on that horse 20 years ago with no problem, and it might be a little rickety today. And he felt that was really important for the character, and I think he was right.
This next question, they asked the director and the producers, Kathleen Kennedy and Frank Marshall, why Harrison and all of them were so excited to work with Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
Well, certainly after we got her involved, but both Harrison and I had seen her magnificent show, and early on we talked about this character being potentially played by her, mainly because we both thought she was kind of this marvelous energy to play opposite him, but also someone new that just, I didn't somehow think we should just kind of cast someone on the big screen. I think these movies have a way of introducing you to someone and a fresh energy. But yes, when we started and when I was writing with Jez and John Henry, one of my favorite movies is The Lady Eve. It's a Preston Sturges movie from the 30s, and Barbara Stanwyck plays this kind of card-sharp con woman who basically tricks Henry Fonda into falling in love with her to try and get all his money. And but it's there's some, if you haven't seen the film, watch it. But it's a miraculous performance by Barbara Stanwyck, but it's also kind of something we don't see anymore, which is, with everyone's kind of focus on likability all the time and characters who don't do anything bad. She's a con woman, using everything she's got to get wherever she can get in this hardest of all worlds, and Barbara Stanwyck in that movie. And I love that idea that Indy is faced with cynicism, with someone who doesn't believe in the kind of ideals that he comes from and that he believes in, and that is faced with someone much more like the modern cynical world we know, who's just kind of, how do I get famous? How do I get my piece of the cash? How do I get somewhere fast and use what I know and what I have to get there? And so we asked Kathy to somehow get the pages we were working on to her. She responded.
Kathy, you worked with her on Solo, so you
Yes,
knew her
I
well.
knew
Yeah.
I knew Phoebe.
Yeah.
And certainly Harrison was really the one that posed the idea of Phoebe first. He just loved her. And he said if there's any way that she can be Helena, he just knew. And this is something I actually watched happen when I worked with Clint Eastwood. You know, there's nothing better than people like Clint Eastwood and Harrison Ford that recognize that casting Meryl Streep or casting Phoebe Waller-Bridge is going to up their game. And I think that that's what Harrison realized too, is that if he had Phoebe to play opposite, it was only going to make him better. And I think that's the sign of somebody who is really comfortable in understanding who they are as an actor. And I think that certainly with the duo of these two, it's just fun and a real joy to watch the two of them just go through this banter. And I know Harrison loved it, and Phoebe absolutely adores him.
Next, Frank Marshall got asked about how did you get all of these great actors to sign on for this last Indiana Jones movie?
They were really just shooting for the stars. And in fact, there's a really small role that Antonio Banderas said he was excited to play.
It was wonderful, and again, it's the writing, it's the part. When they read the part, they go, I want to be in that movie.
Yeah, you got Antonio Banderas, a leading man, playing a nice smallish character role, isn't it? That's a joy.
It was crazy. I mean, we kept offering things to people just because, you know, Kathy and I would get on the phone. It's like, well, if you could have whoever you wanted, who would it be? Oh, Antonio Banderas would be awesome. And we'd be like, well, he's never going to do it. It's like, I'm in. And you know, and Mads Mikkelsen, I had the same reaction. I was like, he's just played a villain in that other picture. He's not going to want to do this. And he just was nominated for an Oscar. And literally, we sent him a script, and 2 days later, I was on a Zoom with him where I thought ostensibly I was going to have to convince him to be in the movie, and he just comes out and he goes, I'm doing it. And
I think that's true, that it is kind of fascinating to look back at this and realize that almost all of our first choices
are in the
were
movie. Yeah.
It was, and I don't want to make it sound like it was just easy,
Yeah.
but it definitely was a surprise that they responded to the script as quickly as they did and wanted to be in the film.
Then James Mangold was asked, what's the trick to making a successful Indiana Jones action sequence? We know Spielberg knew how to do it, so Mangold's answer is interesting as well.
Interesting. Several things. One, I mean, I don't profess, this would be what I'd say. Someone might have a better idea. But the first thing you do is you take the words action sequence, and you know, we have all these terms. I'm very suspicious of the terms we use in filmmaking because they tend to box us in to a way of thinking. The words make us think about something, you know. Is this, someone will say, it's a tracking shot. Well, is it tracking arresting subject movement? Is it countering subject movement? Entirely different things. What kind of dolly shot is this? Is it, if I follow you walking down the street concurrently, you actually are static. So but the wheels are turning under the camera. So when I say that action sequence, it could be an action sequence like in a Mission Impossible movie or a James Bond movie. It could be an action sequence like what an Indiana Jones action sequence means to me is that it's got to possess, you almost have to think of it like a musical number, that there is a kind of comedy and joy and Rube Goldberg kind of connectivity, that the hero isn't always getting out because he's smartest or strongest or impervious. Often it's just he's lucky, and there's as much Bugs Bunny or Roadrunner or Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd in an Indiana Jones action sequence as there is of course you want the brawn, but we've gotten to where action sequences in movies, you know, between Bond films and Bourne films, and and even films I've made have much more brutalistic action or much more kind of visceral action, but I don't think that's what an Indiana Jones film is about. It's about action as a kind of dance. If
Well,
that
and
makes
Jim,
any
I
sense.
think you epitomize it in the Tuk Tuk Chase. And that was pretty extraordinary, watching what Jim did to build that sequence and what it took to keep going back and finding all those little moments, because what you're talking about is the issue of timing, just like comedy. It's the rhythm of what you're delivering and when and where the surprises are. And that was, I think, just brilliant to watch that come together.
It's also telling the story. It's moving the story forward as well. It's not just action for action's sake.
And character beats as well.
Yes, you want, the same is true in a musical. You know, a musical number in a movie where the character story doesn't go forward, is just the movie stopped and there's a song. You want something to happen, and it's very interesting. So you end up puzzling on these action sequences in really interesting ways, because it's kind of like, if you study like Buster Keaton movies, and it's all, and certainly what Steven has done, it's that the thing keeps inverting or mutating on itself. You know, they start on one tuk-tuk, then he gets abandoned, and now they're on two, and now they're racing each other, and then that one gets smashed, and now he's on theirs, and now she jumps off, and so you're building this whole kind of ballet of development, complication, new obstacle, development, complication, new obstacle, that isn't just about this car's rolling, this car's smashing, that blows up, which is a lot of what action has become now, is kind of just like a kind of bidding war or arms race of just pyrotechnics. That's not what Steven was ever doing in these pictures.
Steven always called it escalating action.
Right.
And just what you're saying, it was always about building upon that. It was never about just keeping it the same.
Cool. Frank, what's the value of Indiana Jones going on location?
Authenticity, reality. I think in the very first movie, in Raiders, it was also really a lot of fun to go to Tunisia and to Hawaii and to shoot here. But it's really about putting the characters in places the audience has never seen before, and the reality of those characters in those situations in a real place. And it just makes it more believable and more tangible to what the story is.
It's all that, and it's better for the actors. It's better for everybody, because you're confronted by all the stuff that makes being alive real. You know, if I'm doing a scene in the wind in a room like this, that means there's a guy with a fan standing over there, and I'm looking at a big void. Yeah, and I'm looking at a void, and someone's saying, "The helicopter's that tape over there," and you know, you can be Harrison Ford, you can be Phoebe Waller-Bridge, you can be Mads Mikkelsen, but it's still not the same looking at a X on a board and pretending it's a helicopter. It's not the same having, you know, Frankie with the fan blowing on you, and being outside and feeling a desert wind. So there's a cumulative effect to the verisimilitude of just being in the world, you know.
It's also about the character. You know, this is an adventure, an archaeologist exploring the world, and I think that also made it attractive for the audiences. We're going to go someplace we've never seen before.
Next, they were asked about all of the challenges filming during COVID.
It was a brutal challenge on this movie, because we
Yeah.
shot it in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, so it's not like we could just hop off and fly anywhere. I mean, in fact, Morocco was going to be India, and then COVID got so bad in India, we had to rewrite our way to Morocco. So we were always adapting to we had a new challenge that movies hadn't faced at that point, was somehow adapting to the world as a kind of wave of COVID spread across it, and we tried to figure out where we could safely shoot.
And who had the inspired idea of having Glasgow double for New York?
Adam Stockhausen,
Adam Stockhausen, yeah.
our production designer, really
I often
brilliant.
go to Glasgow and think, yeah, it looks like
No,
60s
well,
New York.
the interesting thing that Adam discovered, I didn't know this, I don't think any of us knew this, is the architect that actually built many of the original roads and buildings and whatnot for Manhattan built Glasgow.
The city planner.
Yeah, city planner
the
was
grid.
exactly
so the
the
grid
same.
of Glasgow is very
And
similar to
so,
Manhattan.
yeah, that's what was really extraordinary is suddenly we found this out. We're standing in Glasgow. Now, the only tricky little thing becomes extras and accents. But we managed to work that out just great. But it's an amazing, fascinating double.
You made the bagpipes easy, though.
So then Frank Marshall got asked a little bit about their favorite locations and the challenges filming at those places, even all the way back to Raiders.
It's really interesting. For Raiders, they actually filmed the beginning at the end. So listen to this.
I have to say Nefta, Tunisia, was our first, for me, it was really my first trip to the Sahara Desert. And, you know, as a producer, our job is to help the director get their vision up on the screen. And it's those challenges that were at their height on Raiders in the desert. We were right next to...
No, that's where many of the people in this audience I know Star Wars. So obviously, George was extremely familiar with Tunisia, and that had a lot to do with why we ended up going there on Raiders.
Yeah. And then we actually planned it beautifully. We started in La Rochelle, France.
Yeah.
It was the first week with the submarine. And we moved back here, and we had a great time out at Elstree. Then we moved to Tunisia, where it was 130 degrees every day. It was brutal heat. And then Kathy, Stephen, and I, the crew was going to take a day off or two, and there was an air traffic controller strike, and you couldn't fly. And so we just said, we're getting on the plane. We got on the plane, and 22 hours later, we landed in Hawaii. And so we spent the last 3 weeks of the movie in Hawaii. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience.
So you wrapped shooting the opening. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we shot the opening last. And one day, Stephen came up and he said, you know, I had this idea. Can you go find me a mountain that looks like the Paramount Mountain? We were in Kauai.
Yeah.
I said, sure. You always say you can do it, right? And so I took Kathy and her twin sister Connie, who's here with us, and we drove around Kauai, and there it was. And we backed up enough that we knew we could get it in the frame, and then we found out who owned the property, and that's it. It was never in the script.
And then from that point forward, every movie we had to find the mountain.
Except
And it's now a tourist site on Kauai.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then they started telling us about how they take the Paramount Mountain and morph it into an actual mountain for those movies. But it was a little bit different this time, and...
Yeah, I don't think they meant for us to ask a question yet, but I was like, I just asked, I mean, why didn't we get the Paramount Mountain? Because the logo's in there.
Yeah, so thankfully Kathleen Kennedy jumped in and answered that question for us. And then John got to ask another really great question.
Well, you know, we've watched those previews over and over and over again, and there's a few scenes in there that weren't in the movie. So I asked Mangold about that as well.
So why not this one?
Well,
It didn't open. The Paramount logo was not the last logo up.
Disney bought the company.
Yeah.
So we debated, do we do a castle? I mean, we actually had that conversation. I'm not kidding. We didn't do it. We decided to use Lucasfilm. And that's why the lock at the beginning
The hinge
is out of
was
Lucasfilm. But it's basically the same concept.
Thank you. As fans, we've had months to just kind of pour over the trailers. And so I've now had the opportunity to see your movie twice. And I noticed there was a large boulder, the size and shape of the boulder that entered the beginning of Raiders and chased Indy down the rock cavern. And that was in one of the trailers, but it wasn't in the movie. So I know you have to cut these things, so I'm curious about why it got cut. And I'm also curious about whether we'll see some of those things on a DVD release. I know Spielberg's been kind of historically reticent to show anything that wasn't in the movie, but we'd love to see some of that stuff.
There was a sequence in the tombs that there was one chamber that we lost, so sharp eyes and you caught it. But I'm not sure it would really be all that much to see on its own. I'm kind of inclined to agree with Stephen. It's just kind of like things come out for a reason. It was better without it than it was with it. Like it's a movie isn't just a collection of pendants on a necklace. It's how each thing falls into the next. And that sequence was somehow better without that one added chamber in the tomb. And those are things you discover cutting a movie. You know, they're just kind of, it's one of the miracles of cutting as a movie is just taking one domino out sometimes affects a scene 30 minutes later in ways that you can't ever anticipate.